The tears streamed down Lila Lamont's flushed cheeks as she sat on the edge of the old stone fountain in Willow Springs, her wedding gown mudded at the hem and her veil discarded beside her like a forgotten promise. The year was 1878, and she had just become the most scandalous topic of conversation in the entire Arizona Territory, the bride who was left at the altar by Carson Miller, the banker's son who had apparently fled town with most of his father's money the night before their wedding. The town square had emptied after the spectacle. Most folks had the decency to leave her to her grief, though she knew the whispers would start soon enough. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty square as Lila stared into the fountain's murky water, wondering how her life had come to this moment of complete humiliation. She didn't notice the tall figure approaching until his shadow fell across the water. Lila looked up, hastily wiping her tears with the back of her hand to see a man she didn't recognize. He wore a dusty brown hat, a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and chaps that had seen better days. His spurs jingled softly as he shifted his weight. "Beggin' your pardon, madam," he said, his voice low and gentle. "Seems like you're having about the worst day a person could have." Lila tried to straighten her posture to salvage what little dignity she had left. "I'm not in need of company, sir," the stranger nodded, not taking offense. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, turning it over in his calloused fingers. "My ma used to say that a wish made in tears carries the most truth." He flipped the coin into the fountain, where it sank to the bottom with a small splash. "I just put my future in that water. Figured you might need someone who's willing to risk something too." Despite herself, Lila found her curiosity piqued. "And what exactly did you wish for, Mr. Yancey Caldwell," he answered, touching the brim of his hat. "And I can't tell you what I wished for, else it won't come true. That's the rule, ain't it?" For the first time that day, Lila felt the ghost of a smile touch her lips. "I suppose it is, Mr. Caldwell." The man's face brightened at her smile. "Folks just call me Yancey. I just rode into town looking for work. I hear the Double R Ranch is hiring hands." "They are," Lila confirmed, thinking of the massive ranch owned by the Richards family that employed half the men in the county. "Though they prefer experienced cowhands. Been riding since I could walk, madam. Breaking horses since I was 14. I reckon I'll do fine." His eyes, a warm hazel that reminded her of autumn leaves, studied her with concern. "Can I walk you somewhere? Doesn't seem right to leave a lady in distress all alone." Lila hesitated. Her parents' home was the last place she wanted to go, with her mother's disappointment and her father's quiet anger. The boarding house where she'd been preparing to move with Carson was now out of the question. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted, the words catching in her throat. "Everyone will be talking about poor, foolish Lila who couldn't even get a man to show up to their wedding." Yancey frowned, looking genuinely troubled by her predicament. "I passed by a small cafe on my way here. The lady there looked kind. Maybe we could get you something warm to drink, give you time to think." The simplicity of his suggestion, devoid of pity or judgment, made Lila nod. She stood, wobbling slightly in her wedding shoes, and Yancey offered his arm without comment. It was a gentle, steadying presence, and Lila found herself grateful for the support as they walked across the square toward Martha's cafe. Inside, the cafe was mercifully empty except for Martha herself, a plump woman in her 50s who took one look at Lila's wedding dress and immediately bustled over. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, leading Lila to a table in the back corner. "I heard what happened. That Carson Miller never was worth the ground he walked on. You sit right here, I'll bring you some tea." Lila sat, feeling oddly detached as Martha hurried away. Yancey took the seat across from her, removing his hat and placing it on the table. "I take it the groom had a change of heart?" he asked quietly. Lila's laugh was brittle. "A change of heart would imply he had one to begin with. No, Mr. Caldwell, it seems my former fiancé, was more interested in his father's money than in marriage. He disappeared last night, along with several $1,000s from the bank vault." Martha returned with 2 steaming cups of tea and a plate of biscuits. "On the house," she insisted, patting Lila's shoulder before retreating to give them privacy. "So he's not just a coward, but a thief too," Yancey said, shaking his head. "Forgive my bluntness, madam, but you may have had a lucky escape. Better to find out now than after you were bound to him by law." Lila stared into her tea, considering his words. "Perhaps, but now I have no husband, no home of my own, and a reputation in tatters." She looked up at him. "You must think I'm terribly self-pitying." "Not at all," Yancey said. "Seems to me you're entitled to a good cry and some anger, but I also reckon you're stronger than you know right now." There was something in the way he looked at her, not with pity, but with a quiet confidence that made Lila sit a little straighter. She took a sip of her tea, letting the warmth spread through her. "You're not from around here," she observed. "Where are you from, Mr. Caldwell?" "Texas, originally. Been moving around the territories for the past few years. Worked ranches in Colorado, New Mexico, now Arizona." He broke a biscuit in half, offering part to her. "Never could stay in one place too long." "Why is that?" Yancey's eyes clouded slightly. "Lost my family in a fever epidemic when I was 18. Our ranch went to pay debts. After that, didn't see much point in putting down roots again." Lila felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry," he shrugged, but she could see the old pain there. "It was 8 years ago now. I've made my peace with it, but it taught me that life can change in an instant, for better or worse." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the clink of teacups and the distant sounds of the town filtering through the cafe windows. "What will you do now?" Yancey finally asked. Lila had been asking herself the same question since she'd realized Carson wasn't coming. "I don't know. I was a school teacher before I got engaged. I suppose I could try to get my position back, though the school board might not be eager to hire a woman who's been so publicly humiliated." "Seems unfair to hold someone else's actions against you," Yancey said with a frown. "That's not how things work for women, Mr. Caldwell," Lila replied, a note of bitterness in her voice. "We carry the burden of men's mistakes as well as our own." Yancey nodded slowly. "Well, I don't know much about society's rules, but I do know that a woman who can sit with dignity after what you've been through today has more strength than most cowboys I've ridden with." His sincere compliment brought warmth to Lila's cheeks that had nothing to do with embarrassment. For the first time since the disastrous non-wedding, she felt a flutter of something other than despair. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. "You've been unexpectedly kind to a stranger." "Yancey," he reminded her with a small smile, "and kindness doesn't cost anything. Besides, I've had my share of bad days. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to sit with you through it." As the evening shadows lengthened outside, they continued talking. Lila learned that Yancey was 26, had a gift for training difficult horses, and could read and write better than most cowboys. His mother had been insistent on education. He told her stories of cattle drives and the characters he'd met on the trail that made her laugh despite herself. In turn, she told him about growing up in Willow Springs, her love of teaching the town's children, and her dreams of someday seeing the ocean. She carefully avoided mentioning Carson until Martha came by to light the lamps as darkness fell. "I should get home," Lila said reluctantly, looking down at her wedding dress with a grimace. "Though I'm dreading facing my parents." Yancey stood, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll walk you there if you'd like." The streets were quiet as they made their way toward the modest house where Lila had grown up. A few curious faces peered from windows, but Lila held her head high, drawing strength from Yancey's presence beside her. At her gate, she turned to him. "Thank you for today. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "You'd have been just fine," Yancey said with certainty, "but I'm glad I could help." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be around for a while if the Double R hires me on. Perhaps I could call on you sometime. Properly, I mean." The request was so unexpected that Lila blinked in surprise. "You want to call on me, after all this?" "Especially after all this," Yancey said firmly. "I've met a lot of people in my travels, Miss Lamont, but few with your kind of grace under fire. I'd like to know you better if you'll allow it." Lila found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided. "I think I'd like that, Mr. Caldwell." He smiled, tipped his hat, and turned to go. Lila watched him walk away, the sound of his spurs fading into the night, and felt the first tentative stirrings of hope take root in her heart. True to his word, Yancey secured work at the Double R Ranch. 2 weeks after their meeting at the fountain, he appeared at Lila's door on a Sunday afternoon, freshly bathed and wearing his best shirt, to ask if she might like to take a walk with him. Her mother, initially scandalized at the idea of Lila stepping out so soon after her failed wedding, was gradually won over by Yancey's respectful manner and steady gaze. Her father, a quiet carpenter who had never much cared for Carson's flashy ways, seemed to approve of the cowboy's practical nature and strong handshake. Spring turned to summer, and Lila found herself looking forward to Yancey's weekly visits with increasing anticipation. She had indeed lost her teaching position, the school board citing moral considerations after the scandal, but had found work assisting the town's seamstress, Mrs. Peterson, who cared more about Lila's neat stitching than town gossip. On a warm July evening, they sat together on the small bench in her parents' garden, the scent of her mother's roses heavy in the air. "I've been thinking," Yancey said, his hat in his hands as he turned it slowly. "The foreman at Double R is pleased with my work. Says I have a way with the more difficult horses. He's offered me a permanent position with better pay and a small cabin on the property." Lila felt her heart quicken. "That's wonderful news. You deserve it." "Thing is," Yancey continued, his voice growing softer, "that cabin's mighty empty for just one person." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "I know it's only been a few months, Lila, and I know you've had your trust broken. But I find myself thinking about you from sunrise to sunset, and I'm not a man who's easily distracted from his work." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying, Yancey?" "I'm saying that I love you," he said simply. "I think I started falling in love with you that day at the fountain, when you had every reason to wallow but instead showed such strength. And every day since has only confirmed what I felt then." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring with a single pearl. "This was my mother's. I've carried it with me all these years, never thinking I'd find someone I wanted to give it to, but now I have." Yancey slid from the bench to one knee, looking up at her with those honest hazel eyes. "Lila Lamont, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Lila's hands trembled as she reached for his face, touching his cheek gently. "You know people will talk. They'll say you're taking Carson's leavings, that I was so desperate I latched onto the first man who showed interest." "Let them talk," Yancey said firmly. "I've never cared much for other people's opinions. Only yours matters to me." Tears welled in Lila's eyes, but unlike those she'd shed at the fountain, these were born of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Yancey Caldwell." His smile was like sunrise as he slid the pearl ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her all along. The wedding was held in September, a simple affair in the town's small church. There were whispers, of course, and a few raised eyebrows, but Lila found she cared less than she would have imagined. Mrs. Peterson had helped her create a wedding dress of pale blue rather than white, a practical choice. Lila had said, though both women knew it was also a statement that this was a new beginning, not a replacement for what had been lost. Yancey stood tall at the altar, looking at her with such transparent adoration that several of the town's most dedicated gossips were seen dabbing at their eyes. When he took her hands in his and promised to cherish and protect her all the days of his life, his voice never wavered. Their cabin at the Double R was indeed small, but Lila transformed it with curtains she sewed herself, wildflowers in mason jars, and the careful arrangement of the few possessions they each brought to their marriage. Yancey built shelves for her books and a rocking chair for the porch where they could watch the sunset together. Life as a ranch wife was different from anything Lila had known, but she adapted with determination. She learned to cook over a wood stove, to manage on the modest but steady income Yancey brought home, and to treat minor injuries that came with ranch work. In return, Yancey taught her to ride properly, not side saddle as she'd been instructed as a girl, but astride like the ranch women did, and to shoot a rifle accurately enough to protect herself when he was away on cattle drives. Their first winter together brought challenges. The cabin's roof leaked during heavy rains, money was tight, and Lila discovered she was with child just as Yancey had to leave for a 2-week journey to deliver horses to a ranch in New Mexico. "I don't have to go," he said, holding her close as she told him the news. "Reynolds can take the horses instead." "No," Lila said firmly, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "We need the money, especially now. I'll be fine for 2 weeks." "You're the strongest woman I know," Yancey said, pressing his lips to her forehead. "But I'll ride like the devil to get back to you as soon as I can." The 2 weeks stretched to 3 when a sudden snowstorm trapped the horse delivery party in a mountain pass. Lila fought back worry each night, reminding herself that Yancey was experienced and cautious. Still, she found herself going to the old fountain in town, tossing in a penny of her own and whispering a prayer for his safe return. When he finally rode into the ranch yard, thinner and with a new scar on his jawline from a fall on icy ground, Lila ran to him with such abandon that several of the ranch hands turned away to hide their grins. Yancey swung down from his horse and caught her in his arms, burying his face in her neck as if drawing in her scent like a man who'd been too long in the desert. "Don't ever scare me like that again," she whispered fiercely. "Never," he promised. "I thought of nothing but getting back to you and our little one." That night, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Lila told him about her visit to the fountain. "I threw in a coin just like you did that day. It seemed right somehow to complete the circle." Yancey's fingers traced gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. "What did you wish for?" "I can't tell you," she teased, echoing his words from nearly a year before. "Or it won't come true. That's the rule, remember," he laughed, pulling her closer. "I suppose I should tell you what I wished for that day at the fountain, now that it's already come true." Lila propped herself up on one elbow, genuinely curious. "What was it?" "I wished for a home," Yancey said simply. "Not just a place to hang my hat, but a real home. With someone who would look at me the way you're looking at me right now." Tears pricked at Lila's eyes as she leaned down to kiss him. "I think we both got our wishes then." Their daughter, Emma Rose Caldwell, was born the following spring, with her father's hazel eyes and her mother's determination. Yancey paced outside their cabin while the ranch foreman's wife, who had delivered half the children born on Double R land, helped Lila through a difficult birth. When he was finally allowed inside, the sight of Lila, exhausted but radiant, holding their tiny daughter wrapped in a blanket Lila had stitched during the long winter evenings, brought the stoic cowboy to his knees beside the bed. "She's perfect," he whispered, one calloused finger gently stroking the baby's cheek. "Just like her mama." Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and milestones. Yancey's skill with horses earned him increasing respect and responsibility at the ranch. By Emma's second birthday, he had been promoted to assistant foreman, which meant more regular hours and fewer long journeys away from home. Lila, meanwhile, had begun teaching again not at the town school, but in an informal arrangement with other ranch families. 3 days a week, children from across the Double R and neighboring properties gathered in the ranch's communal hall for lessons. The ranch owner's wife, Mrs. Richards, had seen Lila reading to Emma and engaged her in conversation about education, which led to the makeshift school. "You found your calling again," Yancey observed one evening as Lila prepared lessons at their kitchen table. "You light up when you talk about those children." Lila smiled, setting aside her papers to pour him a cup of coffee. "I never thought I'd teach again after everything that happened. It feels like a gift to have this second chance." "You deserve every happiness," Yancey said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Though I still think Willow Springs lost the best teacher they ever had." "Their loss was your gain," Lila replied with a smile. If I'd still been teaching there, I might never have been sitting at that fountain that day. Yancey's expression grew serious. Do you ever regret it? How things turned out, I mean. Lila shook her head firmly. Not for a moment. Carson's betrayal hurt terribly at the time, but now I can see it was the luckiest escape of my life. She squeezed his hand. He never saw me clearly, not really. He saw a suitable wife who would improve his standing. You saw me at my worst moment and still believed in my strength. Their conversation was interrupted by Emma's calls from the small bedroom where she'd been napping. Yancey rose to get her, returning with their tousle-haired daughter perched on his shoulders, giggling as he pretended to be her horse. Watching them, Lila felt a contentment so deep it almost overwhelmed her. This, she thought, was what love was meant to be, not the showy courtship Carson had offered, but the steady partnership she and Yancey had built, day by day. When Emma was 4, Yancey came home one evening with news that would change their lives again. The owner of a neighboring ranch, old Mr. Thornton, had died without heirs. His modest property, 160 acres with a small herd of cattle and a sturdy house, was being sold by the bank that held his mortgage. I've saved almost enough for a down payment, Yancey said, his eyes alight with possibility. If we're careful, we could make the rest of the payments from what the cattle bring in. We could have our own place, Lila, not just a cabin on someone else's land, but a real ranch of our own. Lila's heart raced at the idea. But is it too risky? What if we can't make the payments? There's always risk in anything worth doing, Yancey acknowledged. But I've learned a lot these past years. The land is good, the water rights are secure, and I know cattle. Plus, he added with a smile, I happen to be married to the smartest woman in the territory who can keep the books better than any banker. They stayed up late into the night, calculating figures and weighing options. By morning, their decision was made. They would take the chance. The day they signed the papers at the bank in Willow Springs, Lila insisted on making one stop before they returned to pack up their cabin at the Double R. The fountain? Yancey asked with a knowing smile as she led him to the town square. It seems right, Lila said, reaching into her purse for 2 coins, one for each of them. This is where our story began. They stood at the fountain's edge, the same place where Yancey had found her in tears 5 years earlier. The water still burbled softly, coins glinting at the bottom among smooth stones. Together? Yancey asked, holding out his coin. Lila nodded, and in unison they tossed their coins into the water. They watched the ripples spread and merge just as their separate lives had done. What did you wish for this time? Lila asked, breaking their own rule. Yancey laughed, pulling her close to his side. That our children will know the kind of love we've found. Children, Lila raised an eyebrow. Plural, he shrugged, a faint blush touching his tan cheeks. Emma needs siblings to boss around, doesn't she? Unless you think otherwise. Lila's smile widened as she took his hand and placed it gently over her stomach. I think it's a good thing you wished for that, because in about 7 months, it's going to come true. Yancey's expression of shock quickly transformed into joy as he lifted her off her feet in a spin that made her laugh out loud, heedless of the curious stares from townspeople passing by. Another baby, he whispered against her hair when he set her down. Another miracle. Our own ranch, another child on the way, Lila mused, leaning against him as they began walking toward where their wagon waited. We've come a long way from that day at the fountain. And yet, Yancey said, looking back at the fountain one last time, I'd say that was the luckiest day of my life, finding you in tears beside that old stone basin. Who would have thought that the worst day of your life would turn into the best of mine? Lila thought of the young woman she had been, crushed by betrayal and humiliation, and the life she had found instead, a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined with Carson Miller. Sometimes, she said softly, the endings that seem most devastating turn out to be the most beautiful beginnings. They named their new ranch Fountain Creek, a private acknowledgement of where their journey together had started. Their second child, a son they named James, arrived in the coldest part of winter, with the local midwife barely making it through the snow in time. He had Lila's eyes and Yancey's stubborn chin. Over the years, their family and their ranch prospered. 2 more children followed, another daughter and son, giving Emma the siblings Yancey had wished for. The house expanded with rooms Yancey built himself, and the cattle herd grew until Fountain Creek was known as one of the most successful small ranches in the county. Lila's informal school eventually found a permanent home in a small building Yancey and some of the neighboring ranchers constructed on their property. Children rode for miles to learn from Mrs. Caldwell, whose reputation as a fair but demanding teacher spread throughout the territory. They faced challenges of coarse droughts that threatened the cattle, a fire that destroyed one of the barns, Emma's dangerous bout of scarlet fever when she was 12. But through it all, the foundation they had built held strong. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Yancey surprised Lila by taking her to Willow Springs for the day, leaving their younger children with Emma, who at 19 was as capable as her mother. They walked familiar streets, marveling at how the town had grown, stopping to greet old acquaintances. Carson Miller's name occasionally still came up in conversation. He had eventually been caught in San Francisco and served time for his theft, but it no longer had the power to hurt Lila. It was merely a footnote in a life that had taken a far better turn. As evening approached, Yancey led Lila to the town square where the old fountain still stood, looking much as it had 20 years before. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet pouch. "I've been saving it for today." Inside the pouch was a delicate gold locket. When Lila opened it, she found a tiny photograph of their family on one side, and on the other, something that made her gasp: the silver dollar Yancey had thrown into the fountain that first day, now polished and mounted. "How did you?" she began, looking up at him in wonder. "I may have waded into that fountain very early the next morning to retrieve it," Yancey admitted with a sheepish smile. "I had a feeling even then that you were going to be important to me, and I wanted to keep that coin as a reminder of the day we met." Tears filled Lila's eyes as she clutched the locket. "All these years, and you still managed to surprise me, Yancey Caldwell." He helped her fasten the locket around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin with the same tenderness they had always shown. "And I plan to keep surprising you for at least 20 more years, Mrs. Caldwell." They stood together by the fountain, watching as the setting sun turned the water to liquid gold. Yancey's arm around her waist was solid and sure, a constant in a world that had seen so much change. "You know," Lila said thoughtfully, "sometimes I think about that girl who sat here crying all those years ago, and I wish I could tell her that everything was going to be more than all right." "What would you tell her?" Yancey asked, his voice soft in her ear. Lila turned in his arms, looking up at the face she had loved through youth and now into middle age, seeing the same warmth in his eyes that had first drawn her to him. "I would tell her to dry her tears," she said, "because a cowboy is about to toss a coin into that fountain and change her life forever. And I would tell her that 20 years from now, she'll stand in this same spot with a heart so full of love that she'll wonder how she ever thought she was broken." Yancey bent to kiss her then, a kiss as sweet and true as their first had been. Above them, the first stars of evening began to appear, witnesses to a love that had begun with tears and a silver dollar, and grown into something as enduring as the mountains on the horizon. As they walked hand in hand back to their wagon for the journey home to Fountain Creek Ranch, Lila felt the weight of the locket against her heart and smiled. Some wishes, it seemed, were powerful enough to build an entire life upon, especially those made beside an old stone fountain, in a moment of both ending and beginning.